Everybody, welcome to the next edition of the Ubuntu desktop team Indaba. This edition is going to be all about the Firefox snap, and I know that some of you might have some questions, concerns, and we're happy to answer them and address them as much as possible. So to just give some more history, I'll throw it to Ollie, but we have Ken here to represent kind of like the desktop team in general. We have Ollie doing some product management. He's done a lot of research and investigation into the Firefox snap with the help of Philip, who's a Snapd engineer. So Ollie, take it away.
Sure, thanks Heather, and yeah, it's nice to be back on the stream. It's been a while. I should drop in more often. Cool. Yes. So I hope everyone's had the chance to see the blog post that I put out yesterday, which is really the culmination of quite a while of sort of research and analysis into what we can do about Firefox. But I really want to talk about the sort of opening section of that blog post, maybe in a bit more detail. I think if you're an eagle-eyed Ubuntu user, you might spot in the desktop installation slideshow a screenshot of one of our sort of product vision decks, and on that screenshot it says Ubuntu desktop is an open source operating system available to everyone that just works for whatever you need. And I think we can maybe do a little bit of work to jazz that up and make that a bit more snazzy. But what I really like about that message is the sort of emphasis on accessibility. So I think Ubuntu does a really great job of going from the sort of really high-end developer who's doing all that sort of cross-platform development and working with extremely advanced tools and really knows their way around Linux, right the way down to the sort of entry-level Linux user. And when we look at the types of people who are viewing our blogs, looking at the site, and where they're downloading Ubuntu desktop, that sort of stuff, there's such a significant group of people who are clearly using Ubuntu for the first time, right? They tend to be younger. They tend to be maybe they're students, maybe they're just learning Linux. And I think what's really important for Ubuntu desktop is really to make sure that entry experience is sort of intuitive and welcoming and easy to use for the people who are maybe not familiar with sort of managing PPAs and doing their updates and keeping on top of all of that. So I think with the Firefox snap, why we got to this point when we were discussing with Mozilla, and as we've said before, this was definitely a decision made sort of driven by Mozilla, is that we think that Firefox as a snap really lives up to that accessibility message, because what it does is it packages it up in a secure way that is really easy to update, and the flow from updates right to the user is much quicker, and it's cross-compatible across different releases of Ubuntu and that sort of stuff. And I think what you're getting there is something that does just work in that instance. Now, that said, there are obviously still ongoing issues that we need to resolve about the Firefox snap. So that first impression is not good enough for us, I think, at the moment, in terms of the that initial startup time and things like that. And there are some outstanding issues with things like native messaging that we're actively working to fix. So living up to that just works ambition, I think, is something that we are continuing to work on. But I think that in the long run, and bear in mind that for Ubuntu 22.04, this is a release that we're going to be supporting for more than 5 years these days. This sort of short-term burst of energy and improvement to make sure that the snap is as fast as it should be and does all of the things that it should do is really going to pay off in the long term, because those benefits are going to be available to users immediately right out of the box. And so I think it is worth this trade-off at the moment is something that we need to resolve, and we're working on resolving. But when we do resolve it, that's going to be the right decision going forward. So yes, maybe that's my overview.
Yeah. So assuming that we were able to solve all the problems with performance issues, then does that create a direct line between Mozilla and the user to have faster, more frequent updates, latest and greatest?
Ken, do you want to talk a bit about how we're sort of getting out of the way between the user and Mozilla?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, this is actually one of the great benefits, and why Firefox is really a great example of some of the power of Snap. Mozilla is the publisher of the Snap. Their release team controls when users get updates. Yes, we have worked with Mozilla to get us to this point a fair bit, but ultimately it's Mozilla doing the work, and um, uh, they can, like I said, they control when updates get out to users, and this isn't dependent on what version of Ubuntu you're running or what distro you're running. Anybody who's part of the Snap ecosystem, if they have the Snap installed, will get those updates within hours of Mozilla publishing it. And I think that's really a powerful feature, right? I mean, especially for a web browser. I mean, that's like the most terrifying piece of software to run on your desktop is a web browser. So having that nicely, containerized, sandboxed, protecting the rest of your system from, potential random JavaScript that's getting loaded inside of your web browser, um, you know, that protection is great, but also as security fixes come out, getting those out rapidly to users is key. So I really think Firefox is a great kind of poster child for this. And we look forward to making these improvements just to make sure everybody loves the experience.
Yeah, that's great.
It might be worth sort of mentioning the sort of overhead that's involved in or has been involved in the past of sort of maintaining maintaining Firefox prior to this, right? Maybe
Yes.
to explain how that sort of created that sort of intermediate sort of step or lag.
Yeah, absolutely. So, maintaining something like a web browser is a tremendous amount of work. And, if you ever do the math to figure out the number of supported versions of Ubuntu that we have at any given time, that number is growing because now we're not only supporting LTSs for 5 years with extended security maintenance, we are potentially supporting them for 10 years for some people. So we have to push out when there's a security fix, which happens relatively rapidly. Our security team stays on top of that. They push things out very quickly. But this has to be done for every supported version of Ubuntu. And by the way, we're pushing brand new versions of Firefox to older Ubuntu releases, which then have dependencies on things like Rust and other bits of the what we call the archive, other packages in the Ubuntu archive. And sometimes those things can be fragile, right? They depend on a new feature in Rust, which isn't available in Bionic or Xenial. And then it's even more work to get that fix out. And then we have to do it rapidly to get the security fix out in the window we have. It's a tremendous amount of work, and it does take weeks to get those updates out using the traditional means. By delivering this as a snap, and it comes directly from Mozilla, that everything required to build that snap can kind of roll right along with Firefox, so it stays current. And this can get out to users within hours of Firefox for making a release upstream, as opposed to potentially weeks for what we did before. So I think it's a tremendous boost.
So it's not like we're handing off that work to Mozilla. We're actually taking the need for that work away altogether. And I think that's interesting, right? Because, it's very obvious now, when I talk about the post, we have a lot of people looking at the Firefox Snap. We have people from the Snapd team, from the desktop team, the people working on the Raspberry Pi, who are all sort of trying to tackle this from different angles. And that looks like a lot of work. But when you actually compare that to the maintenance work that was just pushing out those updates in the past, it's actually quite a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also really valuable to be able to run those newer versions of Firefox on older versions of Ubuntu, since we are supporting things for so long. Yeah. So do we want to jump right into some investigations into some of the performance issues that we've had? Maybe Philip, do you want to highlight some of your findings?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. So I'm Philip from the Ubuntu Core and Snapd team. So the past past few weeks, we've been doing a lot of investigations into Snap, and we're doing a lot of different kinds of investigation. We have done performance analysis, boot charts, startup profiles. We have done almost S-traces, like any kind of like information gathering we could. So now we have a lot of data, and we're trying to crunch that and see what we can kind of discover from this, because from the data we can see there are numerous things that happen during this Firefox startup period that actually takes quite a while. But we're trying to identify exactly what the sinners are in this, and so far it's been hard to point to like one thing and say, oh, there we have it, that's it. It seems to have been like multiple factors, and also depending on the platform we are running on. So we're seeing a little different issues, like running them on Raspberry Pis, for instance, and some other issues on the AMD 64. And when I say issues, I'm just meaning like things that takes time, not actual issues, but things we want to optimize at least. And so far, some of the things we have identified is that in some cases, Firefox is started up using a software renderer, but that's primarily things we've seen on Raspberry Pi. We have seen things like language packs, which are bundled with the Snap, and there's 98 of them. And during startup, Firefox kind of copies these around, discovers them and everything. This takes a while too, and we have done measurements on this. I don't know, should I share measurements like what we've seen so far?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. Like on the Raspberry Pi, for 15 seconds it takes for to handle all these kind of language packs. Now, when I say 15 seconds, I don't mean that it will take, if it didn't do it, it'll take 15 seconds less time. So what it simply means is that one of the threads that's running during startup is doing work for 15 seconds. So let's say we remove it, it might only save you like 5 to 7 seconds on the Pi. But on AMD, which we probably is the more used one, it uses actually 6 seconds during startup to handle these language packs. And I tried to remove them and see what the startup were, and then we kind of the same period, it took only 3.2 seconds. So actually, even though it was 6 seconds of work, removing them saved us 2.8 seconds. So there's still a lot of work going on during the startup of Firefox, and looking at the data, there are some pointers that kind of point to some of this time is spent also on things like font cache or icon themes that take quite a while, and this is something we're also looking into right now. Yeah.
And these things overlap as well, right? The software rendering. Once software rendering kicks in, then those other things that you're talking about are getting slow on top of that, right?
Exactly, and that's why when we say like, oh, this takes 6 seconds, it's not because there are like four or 8 things happening all at once. Like they all kind of influence each other. So remove one, then the 5 different things still need to do run, but they run a lot quicker. So yeah, they influence each other as well. So they might actually take shorter if it wasn't because others slow down. So yeah.
And I'd like to point out that we have looked into performance issues of snaps in the past, and so we're kind of building on that research as well. You might recall that when we transitioned to the Chromium snap, we did some investigation. There's a really nice blog post out there about kind of that investigation, and so performance issues is not something new that we're looking into, but with Firefox, it is kind of all hands on deck to really nip this in the bud, but kind of building on like past experiences.
Yeah, and I think that work that we've done with the Chromium snap is sort of why we sort of innately sort of know that there's things we can do with the Firefox snap, right? Like with the Chromium snap, it boots a lot faster. So there must be some things that are not just the inherent overhead of the confinement or things like that are creating the slowdown. There's definitely things that we can be doing sort of within the structure of Snap to improve that experience. Language packs. Shall we? Ken, do you want to maybe expand a bit on? It seems like a bit of a no-brainer, right? Why are we bringing all 98 language packs in?
Yeah, so and this is something that's different from the Deb, right? The Deb actually doesn't contain all these lang packs because they're split out into separate Debian packages that get installed when you choose your language. We do that through apt and depackage magic to make that happen. But in this case, we really want to bundle all these languages so it's as accessible to everybody as possible. But Firefox internally has code that handles copying these, because the lang packs are actually Firefox extensions, and there's some logic in there to say when it finds the extensions bundled inside of the package, it'll copy it into your profile at startup time. And that's actually a good thing. This sort of thing should happen. However, we should be able to be smarter about it and only copy what's necessary. Like if you're if your language is Spanish, only copy the Spanish lang pack. So something along those lines. We've talked to Mozilla about this. Turns out they've recently, or I'm not sure how recently, but at some point in the not too distant past, they landed a fix for the MSIX package for Windows that solves this exact problem on Windows. So there is some code in there that we could sort of leverage. Right now, that code depends on the Windows platform. So we will work with Mozilla to get that fixed for Linux as well. So this was a good thing we identified, and clearly it's going to be a nice performance boost when we're not copying 98 megs of lang packs on first start.
Yeah, and it's going to be a lot smaller. That's really nice.
I actually have another thing we also saw, because Chromium, and I did some kind of measurements between, for instance, Chromium and Firefox, because again, Chromium kind of starts up very quickly, right? But it seems like also Chromium resources are they are packed a little more together, so they're actually quicker to load into memory. Where Firefox actually spends more time loading all this in because it has a lot of resources. It loads pretty much all its resources in upon startup. So we kind of get a little bit slower startup there as well. It's just a FYI.
Yeah, it's good that we have that frame of reference as well, yeah. Right? So we can make sure that we're trying to improve both as well. Well, I would love to see some questions in the chat that maybe we could handle. Yeah, there we go. The design to optimize for the snap. That's a good question. What do you guys think?
Ken, what are the kind of bespoke tweaks that we might need to, or Mozilla might need to do to the snap? We don't really want to deviate that much, do we, from
no. I don't know if I really understand the question. I mean, the design of Firefox should be the same regardless of how it's packaged and delivered. In fact, that's a very important thing for Mozilla, unless you're talking about more technical design infrastructure, like how things are laid out. That could be something like what Philip was talking about, loading the number of resources that will be loaded at startup. There could be some improvements to be made there.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. We'll have to keep an eye on that. But yeah, we really don't want to that's kind of the point, right? We want to consume exactly what Mozilla is delivering to suss out that middleman.
One of the things Philip talked about was the software rendering. I think it might just be nice to explain what that is and what that means, maybe, because it's a good news story as well, because we actually found that issue and have a fix already in the works. So I think that's something that should be rolling out fairly soon. I know that'll mostly affect Raspberry Pi users, but Raspberry Pi is our sort of worst case scenario for some of these startup times for obvious reasons. But it also was something that may be affecting people with AMD GPUs as well. Philip, do you want to maybe expand on what do we mean by the software rendering issue here?
Yeah, as we've talked about, Snap is a very secure packaging format as well, because we do isolate everything, and we do protect hardware resources. And what happens when it starts up is actually it starts like poking as well to see what kind of graphics card are available and to resolve this graphics driver. And the thing is, it's kind of getting denied in this, and then it ends up not finding this graphics card, and this makes Firefox kind of fall back to software rendering. And this will give you quite an overhead when it comes to like compiling of shaders or anything, because all this will happen on CPU. So on a Raspberry Pi, which have a very it doesn't have that many computation power. It does have that like per wattage, but when it comes to compiling shaders or for like rendering, it's not that powerful. So that's been quite a slowdown, I think, but probably mostly for runtime performance, and maybe a little for the startup. And so what we have done here is we have added the possibility for Snaps to be able to read the necessary information it needs to actually resolve this graphics driver. We already have this in place for most things, but the thing is that the pattern we allow didn't cover the pattern for the Raspberry Pi, and we have seen this as well actually on on the AMD64 with the NVIDIA graphics card or AMD graphics card as well. I actually experienced it myself on my own computer, so that it did fall back on software rendering. So hopefully this, well, not hopefully, we verified that it would be that the fix we have landed should fix this as well.
That's
Yeah,
exciting.
and that's good news. It's actually already landed, which is great. It's not in a released version of Snapd yet, but it has been merged, so it will be making its way out to users pretty quickly. The other point to make here is on devices where this would fall back to software rendering, then that is utilizing the CPU for more things, which slows down processing for other things that needed to happen, right? So when it had to compute these, create these like Mesa shaders in the CPU, while it's trying to do other maybe I/O things that was the CPU was necessary for, it slowed all those other operations down as well. So all these little things will improve across the stack. So little things like that will make bigger improvements.
Yeah, and I just wanted to build on that a little bit because I know that we're, one of the cool things about Snap is, you bundled the dependencies. And so, by using the extension, the GNOME Snapcraft extensions that we've come up with, you're able to get access to newer libraries. And as we have a newer GNOME 42 extension that comes out, then you'll have newer Mesa drivers and stuff. And imagine that like on your a Bionic system. Like that's pretty fantastic. You wouldn't have otherwise had access to that.
Right.
Yeah. Host messaging. How do we tackle that?
Yeah, let me talk about that a little bit. So yeah, we call this a native messaging. So the way this works is, you can have a process running on your host that allows websites to directly talk to services on your host. There's various things, like one great example of this is GNOME extensions. So extensions.gnome.org, you can install and remove GNOME shell extensions directly from your browser. But to do that, it actually needs to talk to this kind of a mediator on your host that then talks to GNOME shell to tell GNOME shell what to do. There's some other use cases for this, like some two-factor auth devices and things like that, that rely on this. So a website can directly talk to a service on the host. So we did some work this past cycle to implement this for the Snap. And effectively what we did was we implemented it in the XDG desktop portals. So there's now a portal. It hasn't actually landed upstream in the portals yet. It's still being reviewed, but we have released it in Ubuntu. In 22.04, it's included. And this provides a portal that, lets you confirm you want to allow access. So, it gives you a sense of security there. And then we'll allow that access that's necessary. So we've done the portal side of that work. We've done the Firefox side of that work. It has not landed in the Snap itself yet for Firefox. It needs to be merged by Mozilla upstream. They're still reviewing it. But once they've reviewed it and merged it, it will be in the next release of Firefox, which we do think will happen pretty soon. Most of the review is done. There's just a little bit of the JavaScript that they're still making some tweaks to. So that's real close. And the good news about this is this will actually also solve the same problem for Flatpaks. So since we did the implementation in the portal, these browsers that are maybe running as Flatpaks could also access the portal to access native messaging on the host. So it's a solution that will solve the problem for others, as well as the Chromium Snap. So I think it's good news all the way around, and we're real close.
Would it just affect all snaps?
No, generally only the browsers need this, because
Okay.
this is really a bridge to allow websites to access services on your host.
Okay. Okay. Very good.
Which can be kind of scary. So you really do want to have a mediator there, right? Like, let's have this random website executing code on your host outside of the browser. This is another great use case for snaps, right?
Yeah, definitely. Even if you don't realize that you're being safer, it's nice to be able to provide that to our users, for sure. Visualization tooling.
Hey, Ziga.
I don't know. What do you think, Ken?
This is probably a good question for Philip. It's probably a good opportunity to talk about SquashFS and things we can do to make improvements there.
Yeah, there are definitely things we can do to look into optimizations for how we store the snaps, but I don't know if there's any tool to visualize the block mappings from file. I don't know, maybe if someone else knows one. But yeah, we're looking into how we store the files and how they are loaded, or maybe some files are more accessed than other, and would it make sense to store those files as uncompressed? There are all these kind of like possibilities, and it's one of the areas we still have to look into. Right now, we're not sure how big a consequence SquashFS is right now for the Firefox snap. And we have some measurements, but they're not enough to show anything conclusive on if SquashFS is one of the big sinners here for Firefox. I don't necessarily think it is, but we don't know for sure yet. And if it starts to show any patterns that this is one of the problems, then yeah, it's going to be one of our priorities to look into both sorting files inside the SquashFS and how we load them, and also look into having maybe some parts of the SquashFS uncompressed, because you can do that.
Yeah, and I think some of the stuff that Ziga was talking about was in the past we had this concept is called read ahead, I believe, where we would determine, I think it was primarily it was something we would load in the initRD that would figure out libraries that were going to be needed at boot early. And we could sequence those sorts of things to load them into memory at boot. It was like a nifty little trick to improve our boot time and app startup time 10 years ago or 12 years ago. We don't really utilize it anymore, but we could do something similar for snaps, and we've kind of been evaluating that.
While we're talking about things like compression, do you want to quickly mention the PGO and LTO optimizations that landed a couple of weeks ago, Ken?
Yeah, so some of the stuff that we found, like, for example, there was a Reddit post that showed this benchmark, which actually does a whole bunch of web operations, and it tells you how many it can do in a minute or some time like that. Effectively, you want the number to be higher, right? Being more efficient. And our build of Firefox for the snap didn't have, as PGO was profile guided optimizations, and LTO, I don't remember what it stands for now, but it's basically a symbol lookup thing for looking up symbols quicker. These were two compiler optimizations that were not enabled in our build, partially because they were problematic on other architectures, and we're building Firefox for a bunch of architectures, not just AMD64. So those weren't enabled in our build. However, the tarball that you would download from Mozilla's website did have those enabled. So it was pointed out that this benchmark, the snap, scored lower. So we did some work, got PGO enabled and LTO enabled for the AMD 64 builds, which then brought the benchmark actually up slightly higher than the tarball. So there's some other optimizations in our stack that have benefited, but effectively it shows that Snapd isn't a performance bottleneck in that sense. There is maybe some overhead at startup that we're dealing with, but at runtime, there's no performance overhead, right? I mean, and so it was great to be able to get those fixes out. Some of that hasn't landed for other architectures yet, like LTO is just not available for ARM devices. So we need to do some things to improve it, like symbol lookup and stuff like that.
Oh, so that could possibly, be responsible for some of the increased response time we see on Raspberry Pi then.
Well, if we're able to solve the symbol lookup issue, and we looked into statically building Firefox on ARM, for example, but actually it turns out Firefox's build system doesn't allow that. So we can't statically link it, but yeah, we'll find a way to improve that. But there's other areas, there's much bigger wins that we can get on ARM for Firefox than that.
Okay.
I think so. For host communication, that's the native messaging for smart card readers. I'm pretty sure that is one of the use cases that this should solve. I think some of the smart card readers do rely on native messaging, and this should solve that problem.
Here's a security one.
This is a touchy question. Yeah, I'll try to tackle this one. So yes, both packaging formats, Flatpak and Snap, provide essentially the entire runtime you need, right, to be able to run your application on that host without relying on libraries and things like that being available on your host, right? And there is some sandboxing available in Flatpak, and I would argue more sandboxing. It's much stricter confinement in Snap. We greatly limit what the application has access to. One of the other things that I would point out is snaps that get published into the store go through a very rigorous review process, some automated and some manual even. Depending on what resources your application claims it needs access to. There's even a voting process where if your app needs access to some particular interface, you have to request it from the store, and multiple reviewers, including the security team, will weigh in and look at your app to see if it really does need that and you're not using it in a malicious way. Many of the Flatpak packages that land on FlatHub, which is kind of the most common place to get them, really don't undergo any sort of security review. So the package developer, the packager, declares what it needs access to, and somebody merges that into the GitHub repository, and it shows up on GitHub on FlatHub. So you don't really have that same level of the same gates that block access to malicious things. I'll point out an example of this. Maybe I shouldn't do this, but I will. There's an extension manager app for GNOME Shell, which is awesome. I love it. I use it all the time. I love GNOME Shell extensions. But in order to install GNOME Shell extensions, you actually need to access a dbus interface that GNOME Shell provides to tell the shell to install extensions, which can be a tricky thing because GNOME Shell extensions are really just JavaScript that gets monkey patched inside your running desktop shell. So it's somebody else's JavaScript that just suddenly gets injected into your running environment. Well, the Flatpak of that, the packager declared that it needed access to that dbus interface, and it just allows it, which it's necessary. I've looked at it. This is it's safe. However, there wasn't really a security review to ensure that that was not malicious, right? So I would argue that having the single store and this review process for snaps gives us a much greater sense of confidence that what you're getting isn't going to be malicious. I'm not saying Flatpak doesn't have security. There is, but these are sorts of things that worry me a little bit, and snaps having the design that we have and the single store, which I know some people complain about, really ensures that we can deliver something that's very secure. at least that we have confidence is secure.
So it's more
Yeah.
about the review process than necessarily the sort of inherent technology. Is that what you're saying, Ken?
Exactly. There is these gating factors, and there is eyes that look at it, and it's something we take very seriously because this is very important to us.
Yeah, and we saw problems similar in the past with PPAs. Anybody could have a PPA, and then a new user, just doesn't really know what they're installing, and it could be malicious. It could just not work. It couldn't be supported. You just don't really know what you're getting. And so at least with the Snap Store, you really do know that it's gone through some critical eyes to make sure that it gets the accesses it needs.
And PPAs are a great example of this. I mean, PPAs are great. Anybody can upload a Debian package, and others can enable that PPA, and they can get access to more software, right? That's great. However, you are trusting the people who publish packages in that PPA to have root access on your machine when you enable a PPA. So when you enable a PPA and maybe it only has Java in it today, the JDK, but then later they publish something else like a Bitcoin miner that has the same package name as something else you already have installed on your system, and you upgrade your system, you suddenly get this Bitcoin miner instead of what you thought you had, without knowing it. They could sneak this stuff sort of in. So you trust the publishers of that PPA to provide software on your system, which is a very scary thing. And Snap kind of solves a lot of those problems, right? Because there are eyes, and there is this review process, and there is trust in the software that you're getting.
I think this goes back to sort of maybe my opening a bit, because I think if this is one of the great things about Linux is that people can choose all of these different routes and go with the packaging format they prefer, or accessing PPAs and things like that. What we're trying to deliver with that default experience is something that is sort of welcoming and accessible to people of any skill level who maybe don't yet have the knowledge to make those sorts of decisions. So we want to make sure that sort of default user journey is delivering something that we're sort of confident in the security and quality of, for those people who don't yet have the experience to make those decisions in an educated way. And we don't prevent those decisions. Anybody can change their packaging format, add PPAs, whatever they like. But we're really focusing on making sure that what we deliver to users of all sort of experience and skill levels is something that we feel is quality and trusted, right?
Yeah. I think that makes us feel a lot safer, for sure. I saw a good question on lang packs. If you guys don't mind going back, if you don't mind going back to this for just a bit, could they be a content snap?
They could potentially. I don't know. We'd have to look at some of the Firefox code there, but I think effectively, if we made them other content snaps, then it would still copy the files that were made available. But then you would also have to choose to install the right content ones. So I don't know if that's really the right solution. I think the best solution is to make Firefox understand which lang pack it needs and only copy the one that's necessary. And I think that should be something we could solve pretty easily. I think the key is, now we understand what that issue is and what the overhead involved is, and we can come up with a proper solution. I think a content snap for it would be kind of over engineering it.
Yeah, thanks for all of the answers. Looking for more questions from you all.
In the meantime, we talk a bit about how people can get benchmarks, and maybe give us their benchmarks.
Yes, absolutely. Let me talk about that a little bit. So Marco on the desktop team created a GNOME Shell extension because, I'm a huge fan of GNOME Shell extensions, because it can be a little bit tricky actually to measure your startup time, right? Because you can't launch the app with the time command and then close the window when it shows. That's not really a good measure. because there's human interaction there. So we can determine when an app was requested to launch and when the window was shown from the window manager. So we were able to do this via GNOME shell extension. So this really only works in a GNOME environment. There could be other implementations for other shells that could kind of follow a similar pattern. But we did this for kind of the default Ubuntu experience. So you can install the startup measurement, I think is what it's called, extension from extensions.gnome.org or from one of my favorite apps, GNOME Shell Extension Manager, which you can install via an app package for that. Just via apt-get install. So you enable that, you install the extension manager, search for startup measurement, install the extension, and then what happens is when you click on the icon to launch it, when the window is rendered, you'll get a notification pop up on the screen that tells you how many milliseconds it took to start. So then you can do your own measurements, and you can measure multiple things like we talked about in the blog post, but I'll explain a little bit here. There's a few scenarios we're trying to measure. One is the warm start, which is, you close the app and start it again. That means libraries are already loaded, profiles are created, and all that sort of thing. That's going to be your quickest startup time. In fact, that's actually quite quick already. That's like, I think 1300 milliseconds or something like that on my really, really slow laptop. But the other ones that are a little bit more problematic are cold starts, which is like right after you've booted your machine. Or even worst case scenario is when you've never run it before on your machine. This is where the profile isn't created. None of those shader caches are created, those kinds of things. The extensions aren't copied. So that's where we do this snap remove -- purge Firefox, which will uninstall Firefox and all of its data, reboot, and then install it again and launch it. So that's kind of like that should be your slowest scenario. So we would love to capture measurements for those kinds of things on various hardware configurations, because like we've mentioned, things like what GPU you have and the video drivers you're using could affect startup time. Spinning disk versus SSD, slower CPU, we know definitely affects this. There is some bits of this that is CPU intensive. So having that information will be very useful.
What about tabs? Does number of tabs matter?
No, that doesn't matter in this scenario because the window is shown. The startup time doesn't include rendering web pages. So that is happens after the window is realized. So once it's shown, the window is drawn, it starts rendering the pages. So we're not worried about measuring that time because that's really not relevant in this case. So the number of tabs won't affect it.
One of the other things that we've put out is actually the version of the Firefox snap that we shipped with 2204, because that then helps us sort of build that timeline of sort of these startup times going down over time. And so rather than us doing that internally, we've actually published that to a channel, which is latest stable jammy-release. Maybe someone could put that in the chat. But what that means is it would be great to see on your hardware sort of this is what Firefox was like when 2204 was released, and this is how far it's come over time. Because I think we want to be able to show that steady improvement. These things are not going to be quick fixes. As we said, there is, as Philip said in particular, there is no one particular issue that is going to sort of solve this overnight. There's a number of things that we're going to explore and we're going to try, and it's not necessarily always going to make things go down, right? And so I think what we want is to show that journey. So it's great to be benchmarking that against sort of the Deb or the Tar or the Flatpak, but it would also be good to be benchmarking it against the previous versions of the Snap, so we can actually see that see the trajectory of that improvement.
Yeah. So benchmarking is very helpful. And there's a discourse thread already that is like the known issues on on Firefox Snap. And so we would love folks to provide any benchmarking data they would like to contribute to that thread, just so we keep all of the Firefox stuff, investigations in kind of one location. There was a good question on GTK themes. There you go.
Yes, I would love to talk about this. In fact, Heather is doing some work right now on a blog post that will be going out real soon on a call for Snap themes. But one of the features that landed in 2204 is theme integration. It's more than that, actually. We have a daemon that we install by default in 2204 now that will allow us to do various things kind of automatically and prompt you when necessary. But like, for example, themes, like say you download a theme from some random website and you extract it in your home.themes directory. So now it becomes available in GNOME Tweaks, so you can change that theme. Like maybe Chicago 95 as an example. That's one that's not packaged already. So then your system looks like Windows 95, right? Because that's what we all want. When we detect that theme change, we will pop up a notification to say, oh, we've detected there's a theme available that will improve your experience improve your experience across your desktop. I don't remember the exact language. And if you choose yes, it will automatically install a matching theme from the Snap store that then makes that theme available to all the snaps installed in your system. So Chicago 95 is not actually snapped yet in the store, so that particular example won't work. However, that's what we're asking for now. There's already a bunch actually installed. There's a specific pattern. They have to be published under a certain name. So GTK-theme name, I believe. And they have to follow a certain pattern, not just the name, which will be detailed in the blog post that goes out hopefully sometime next week. But the idea is we want to get more people snapping themes, so those themes become available to snaps on your system like Firefox. So then they look like the rest of your desktop. We've already done some work in the past to package all the, I would say the most common ones, effectively the ones that are default in some of the more popular distros. We already packaged in one big snap, so they become automatically available. But this is kind of the next step to make others available because people love theming their desktop. So we haven't actually looked into that. Many of the KDE apps will leverage the GTK themes for apps that are GTK, for example. We haven't done any work towards enabling it for pure KDE apps to do the same sort of thing. And I could be wrong here, but from my experience, I think there's less KDE themes that are widely used than there are GTK. Like there's a Breeze, of course, and those sorts of things that are very widely adopted. There are still lots of themes out there, but I think the ecosystem's a little bit different. I would love to talk to somebody about ways that this same sort of model could be implemented for KDE as well. And we would be very willing to work with somebody who wants to help with that. So yeah, if you are interested, please let me know.
Yeah, that would be great. In our final few minutes, maybe we can talk about what to expect going forward, and yeah.
Yeah, so I can maybe talk about our sort of update plan. So if you were looking at the blog post, then you'll notice I put that part 1 there. So the plan is, we're just going to keep plugging away at this until it's good, right? That's our plan. We're continuing these explorations, and so what I would hope to do is, as the issues, particularly the ones that were raised in the blog post, as if they're tracked as bugs or issues, then I'll link to those so you can follow their progress. But also in future blog posts, I'll update you on those fixes as they land, and we'll show you the sort of before and after of the benchmarks and sort of talk about how much of a difference they made. I don't think we're going to have a timeline that goes, okay, by this date we'll have fixed all of these things, because as you say, even with some of the stuff that we're talking about here, we're not sure whether we've really found the root cause of the problem yet. We've found a lot of the data that we've got are symptoms, and actually when you dig a little deeper, this particular thing isn't really the issue that needs to be fixed. I think that's where we sort of got to the software rendering problem, right? And so we're just going to keep updating you. I'm hoping maybe sort of every couple of weeks or so, but it depends on sort of the speed of the fixes. But we will check in regularly, and I'll go back to some of these older posts and make sure that there's sort of links to tracking bugs and stuff as they're raised and as they come in as well. So, you know, in terms of tracking issues that we talk about in the post, they'll stay on the original post, and then the next post will show the outcomes as they land. And we're just going to keep going away at this, and maybe we'll do a couple of deep dives in things like the Raspberry Pi in particular, because it has a few sort of unique wrinkles that maybe we want to just break out and talk about that a bit more. So yeah, we want to be very transparent. Obviously, keep an eye on those weekly desktop team updates as well, because you probably see a few updates on there. Yes, and keep coming in with the benchmarks, because, you know, it's great that we put out those benchmarks and we can show you that relative performance. But I think actually the most compelling thing is when, you know, folks out there in the community are doing it right. It's a more objective test. We can't be cherry picking, all of that stuff. So if you see us talking about a fixed landing, if you can do a before and after benchmark and show that, I think that would be really interesting. It will keep us honest, and it will show that this stuff is really making a difference out there.
Yeah. So please submit some of your benchmarks. We would love to include that in our kind of testing data set.
And finally, sorry, one more thing. If you are seeing or experiencing issues that we aren't talking about in these posts, please do make sure that you're raising them in the known issues discourse thread, or filing them as bugs. There's a link in the blog post to the Mozilla meta bug for the Firefox snap. So if you're sitting there wondering why are they talking about this thing that's really annoying me at the moment, then make sure it's raised and tracked, and we'll be keeping an eye on it.
Yeah. And also we have some open positions for the desktop team too, to help with some browser support and all kinds of things. So if this sounds like something that interests you, please consider applying.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Yeah, desktop team is growing quite a lot this year, so I think
yes, it's been awesome.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting stuff we can do.
I've done a lot of interviews, and I look forward to doing more.
Cool.
Well, thank you all very much. If you have extra questions, please submit them in. You can put them in either like the discourse post for the Indaba or the known issues, and we will happily answer them. Like Ollie said, if you're experiencing something that we haven't addressed, it's not because we're avoiding it. It's just because we don't know. So let us know, and we will take care of it. So thank you, everybody, for watching. Thanks, Ken, Ollie, Philip, for your time, your enthusiasm around getting Firefox to be an amazing Snap application for all of our users. I think that our efforts really show, and we're trying to listen to the community and address as many issues as possible, because our users is what we care about. So thanks all. And we'll see you next month. The next Indaba is going to be June 24th. It'll be a bit later, about 3 hours later than it was today. And we're going to have Carl from Pop! OS on. So get ready to talk System 76 stuff. That's exciting. Yep. Thanks for attending, and see you all next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
Heather.
Thanks.
Thank you.